Everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's cutting-edge conversation about the importance of biotech market access in product commercialization. We appreciate your involvement, and we expect this to be a really lively discussion amongst our esteemed panel and hopefully you, our audience. We're going to start today's webinar by introducing you to our speakers. I'm going to kick it off with a high-level overview of market access considerations in biotech, and then you're going to hear a presentation from each of our panelists about a particular challenge in market access with a proposed solution. We're going to cover the full gamut of drug development timelines in biotech, and it's going to be heavy on the practical application, but rest assured, these speakers and their companies have enormous expertise in this arena and diverse teams that support them and their subject matter knowledge. We're going to take some questions after each presentation, as well as at the end. So let us hear from you. You can send those questions in by using that Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window with the large letters Q&A. Also, if you're interested in getting in touch with any of us, our speakers, or with us here at Scientist, the contact information is going to be displayed on that final slide. In addition, you can access each of these organizations through the scientist.com marketplace and begin working with them immediately. Now, let's meet our speakers. My name is Dr. Patty Peoples, and I'm a health economist with about 30 years experience in the arena. I'm also a pharmacist and an entrepreneur. I serve currently in two positions. I'm president and founder of healtheconomics.com, the world's largest digital connected community for those engaged in healthcare value, evidence, and access. And I also serve as vice president of evidence and content for Scientist.com, the parent company of healtheconomics.com. And I've played a role in the development of our marketplace that is specifically focused on value, evidence, and access. I'd like to also introduce you to each of our speakers. Please meet Dr. Sajjad Raja. Dr. Raja is a director at PRECISIONheor with expertise in a wide variety of HEOR projects, including evidence strategy development, real-world database analysis, chart reviews, and economic models. He's a physician scientist by background with over 60 publications in peer-reviewed leading medical journals. He completed medical school in 2011 from Dow Medical College, and he then pursued a full-time career in outcomes research, starting at the Cleveland Clinic, where he worked for 5 years. We're really glad you're here, Sajjad. Please also welcome Stephen Fountain, the Client Partnership Director at PRMA Consulting. Stephen has more than 15 years of experience in sales, marketing, and market access roles in both consultancy and the industry, and he's worked directly with payers and providers to facilitate market access of pharmaceutical products. Pardon me. He has a deep understanding of HTA, pricing and reimbursement processes, evidence requirements in major markets, and he's worked across a whole variety of therapeutic areas, including oncology, gastroenterology, rheumatology, endocrinology, and rare diseases. Stephen holds an MBA from the University of Durham Business School. Really happy to have you here, Stephen. Please also welcome Sonia Snedekor. Since joining OpenHealth in 2005, which you might know as PharMerit, Sonia has been working in and leading the areas of modeling and meta-analysis. Sonia has expertise in computer modeling and economic evaluations, and she has considerable experience in the area of systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. With formal PhD training in biomathematics, Sonia has combined her technical skills and consulting experience to develop interactive tools and interfaces that enhance evidence dissemination and communication. We're delighted to hear from you today, Sonia. Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, attendees, for joining us. Let's kick it off with a poll. I'd like to hear from all of you. So just engage and let us know if your knowledge of market access for biotechnology products is very high, competent, but you've got some knowledge gaps, about average. Do you know a little, just enough to maybe be dangerous, or almost none, and that's why you're here? So choose one that matches your experience and knowledge level in market access, specifically for biotech. All right, let's look. Well, it looks like we've got actually a pretty nice bell-shaped curve here, that about 20% of you feel like you're pretty competent, but have got some knowledge gaps. And another 20 feel like you're right in the middle. 30% of you, plus the 13% that are really in the area of needing to learn, almost half of you really are here for a good bit of knowledge enhancement. And I hope we can meet the mark there. Thanks for that. All right, I'm going to begin today's webinar with a high-level overview of the current challenges that surround biotech market access. So researchers, if you're in the arena of clinical drug development, are certainly adapting to continuous uncertainty. That's probably a vast understatement. We know that you have particular pressure placed on you for efficient drug development. Maybe you're being asked to find the very best drug candidate, or at the minimum, that minimally accepted profile that you could go to market with. And you're also being asked to fail fast if it looks like that candidate doesn't appear that it's going to advance. So this means that you're probably balancing a whole array of projects simultaneously, a really complex drug development plan, but being asked to keep a good handle on those costs, as well as adhere to the compliance and legal guidelines. It's a challenge, and we get it. And of course, the goal of that clinical development is to commercialize that product so that it comes to market with the strongest possible evidence package so that you've got ultimate market access and optimal reimbursement. All of this is based on what you've done in drug development. And you know that when you come to market, that drug is going to be part of value-based models, strong payer communications, increasingly tight drug benefit management, and pricing scrutiny unlike ever before. So gathering that evidence that can support that is absolutely essential. So if you're here today, I suspect that you want to know what you should be doing at the stage in drug development where you're sitting that can address the needs of your market access strategy. And if that's why you're here, you're in the right place. So let's look at some specific market access challenges that are unique, perhaps, to biotech. Maybe in your company, you've got clinical developers and even the C-suite who may not even agree on some universal definitions for things like market access, what is value, or who are the payers and that we need to pay attention to. So getting on that same page from a definition standpoint is a critical first step. It's possible that you feel like you're in an uphill battle to compete with your company's primary focus on the clinical development without full consideration for the commercialization or the reimbursement needs. Some of you may hear that adding these outcomes, to your major trials will cause delays, or you grapple with an organization that's too lean to accommodate the focus on market access during stage 2 and stage 3. We hear this a lot. Perhaps there's an idea that we're going to do all of this after we're certain that our asset is viable, or even that your company doesn't really need to pay attention to this because you're going to sell that product to someone else to commercialize. So what we're going to do today is give you a knowledge base of why you need to pay attention to these factors in drug development. If you can pause for a minute and let me have a glass of water so I can take care of this. Thank you. So let's set the stage here around some shared definitions before we go forward. Market access for today's purposes is that process with the goal of giving the patient access to that product that they need with an evidence basis that drives which patient should be treated and with what product at what dose. The price of that product is based on the value that can be demonstrated, grounded in cost effectiveness, budget impact, and affordability. Now that's a lot of buzzwords, but the key here is the word you see repeated a couple of times. And those words are evidence and price. These are inextricably linked, and this is what value is. How you link these successfully is what we're going to talk about today. So if you take nothing else away today, I hope that you remember that market access, it's not a one and done effort. It's an ongoing process that gets reassessed at multiple stages through your drug development. Internal events like moving from one phase to another or gaining access to a new evidence basis are going to trigger reassessment. External events like a new competitor coming in or changing market dynamics will also warrant a reevaluation of your market access strategy. So in addition to giving you some insight on what you need to know about biotech market access, we have another goal, and it's to help you see that you're not alone on this journey to figure out that landscape, the customer, the process, the strategy, or to execute the right type of trials. If you have access to the scientist.com marketplace, we have a two-sided solution, like an Amazon type approach, but for contracted research, that can enable you to work with thousands of vendors across every stage of drug development. In market access specifically, we have 350 vendors in all stages of evidence value. And today, you're going to meet 3 of these solution providers. So to wrap up this portion, I'd like to get one more poll, get a sense of where you're standing in terms of where you need the most help with the following market access activities. You can choose multiple responses here. Do you need help today in strategic planning, operations and coordination, actually executing that study or project, communicating the evidence, or in customer-facing interactions? Choose one or more that address your particular unmet need in market access. Give you a couple of more seconds. All right, strategic planning followed by communicating the evidence are the top 2 needs. And I think you're going to be really glad to hear that there's going to be a deep dive on both of those. There's some operations and coordination needs that probably every growing organization deals with, as well as some of you, about 1 out of 4, need some assistance on that customer-facing market access. Thank you. That was very helpful. So with that, I would like to bring on Sajad, who is going to give us a very nice overview of planning, integration, and execution as it relates to biotech market access. Sajad, take it away.
Thank you very much, Betty. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Can you all hear me okay? I think so. All right, so in the next 10 minutes, I have got 3 points to talk about. And if I do my job properly, for each of the points I raise, you will nod and you will go, I know that. That makes sense. But what's important is, how often we forget these. I continue to be surprised at how often I myself go back to some core first principles regarding evidence generation. And so I would like to just reiterate these for you today. And if I'm really successful, you will go, I know all that. But then the challenge is, are you applying them? Because if you are, thank you. We will move on to the next speaker. But if you are not, I would love to talk to you. So before I start, I have a question for you all. And it really gets around the implications of delayed approval and access. I'm not going to ask you to answer this. I'm just going to, put forth a scenario and want you to think about what the answer could be. So if drug X forecasts to meet a significant unmet medical need and to potentially generate peak sales in excess of $3.6 billion a year, has its launch delayed for whatever reason, by 1 month, what is the cost to the firm? Option one, $0. It wasn't a regulatory or payer or HTA issue. Option two, negligible. It's more of a reflection on R&D competency. Option three, $400,000, based on forecast sales in month one. Option four, all of the above, or option five, none of the above. Take a moment. I would argue that actually the cost to the firm is answer five, none of the above, because $3.6 billion a year is about $300 million per month, which is about 10 millions per day. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because as we think about the commercialization of a drug, here x-axis is y, x-axis is time, and y-axis is cost or revenue. So when a drug is in an R&D phase, all you incur is cost: the trial, the development, the manufacturing, all of the wraparound services. And when the drug hits the market, there is this race to the end when there is loss of exclusivity shown on the right-hand side. So clearly, if we can close this value gap, that is make the launch sooner and drive access and uptake and make the drug more widely used, then we generate value. We slow down costs sooner, we generate revenue earlier, and we increase the value that the drug has in the market. So I put forth that example of impact of delayed approval and access upfront because I wanted to show that for a drug that's successful in the market, the stakes can be massive as we close the value gap. So what are some of the critical elements I see to achieve this? Number one, foundation. Understand the evidence base and how it changes over time. Number two, communication. The importance of placing each activity into a wider arc of the story for a product. And number three, integration. That is, it is critical to integrate people, processes, and activities. Let me take a moment on each of these. First is foundation. So as you know, the evidence needs for the drug have dramatically changed. In the 1900s and early 2000s, this is the typical diagram of what would be the evidence challenges, for a drug. And you can see on the green dotted lines several blue dots representing evidence requirements, like understanding the unmet needs, finding your patients, recruiting them into a trial, measuring quality of life, some sort of an early economic assessment. And then maybe a couple years later, when a competitor came along, some challenge around cost and affordability. But what was then what was is now this. Now, I may be amiss to call this a horror story, but it's certainly different. Look at the number of challenges that face the innovator now. Evidence around post-marketing commitments and safety, utilization and treatment adherence. Is the drug effective in the real world? Does it work in the subpopulations? Are there any target populations? How does it compare? What if we switch? The list goes on and on and on. So clearly, the evidence challenges today are significant, and they are ever changing, ever evolving, and ever expanding. But let's be clear, you need to understand where you are starting from. So the value of a robust formal foundation, next slide, please. So the value of a robust, formal foundation is to level set from where you are starting from. And that has a strategic value. A well-conducted assessment of the evidence base for your treatment versus others in the class and others for this disease is a valuable step in understanding not only the comparative effectiveness of your drug, but also helping you design phase 3 and then prepare for HTA appraisals and then understand comparative effectiveness in a post-launch world. So it's important to understand the knowledge base or foundation from which you are coming. Build that knowledge base early on and add to it. So foundation is the first critical element. And this brings me to the second critical element for accelerating the delivery of life science innovations, which is communication. The importance of placing each activity into a wider arc of the story for a product. It's very important that we realize that no one study or project or a paper is answer. Nothing is ever a magic bullet. We need to be able to look at these challenges and recognize that these play out over years, just as the story of a drug plays out over years. I like to call this the arc of a story. So as you think about an individual study, I would encourage you that don't think of them as a standalone piece of work, but rather as a part of a bigger continuum of communication over the life of a product. Think not only how an individual study practically addresses a challenge today, but how does today's study and today's research factor into the overall arc of the story about safe and appropriate drug use. And each of these studies that we talked about just a moment ago actually contributes to the arc of the story over time. Personally, I think we get very caught up in individual studies, be it phase 3 trials, clinical pharmacology studies early on, real world studies or cost effectiveness models. I think it's important that we recognize that each of these studies contributes to an overarching story over the course of time. So this basically means is that, don't forget the big picture. But the skill here is to bounce the big picture with the justification for any one individual study. Well, what does that mean? For those of you with a classical scientific education, you will be very, very familiar with the classical approach of evidence generation, which you are seeing on the slide. There is a gap in human knowledge, a study is designed and conducted, and it generates a research paper. I would argue that in a commercial setting, such as we have in the life sciences industry, that there is a slight modification to this. And that is that we are addressing a challenge in the market. It's critical that that challenge is validated. That is, who is facing the challenge, what do they want to understand, what do they need to know. We then conduct that evidence generation process, not to just deliver a research paper, but deliver a response back to the person, individual, or the organization facing the challenge. So I affectionately call this the bookends model, and I would argue that as we think about the arc of the story and these different challenges that brands will face in the market, anchoring evidence generation in this bookends model is in fact a more pragmatic approach to how we think about what evidence we should generate and the value that evidence brings to the market. Well, this brings me to the third element of my brief comments today, which is integration. As you're all aware, drugs have these different phases and there are challenges around evidence and pricing. And large teams are often established to generate the evidence and think about pricing. And below these green and blue arrows, you will see many of the different activities. And then below that, all these different tactics that fall under the evidence needs assessment. I just wanted to take a moment and look at all the stuff that's to be done. It goes without mention that bringing a pharmaceutical to market is a highly complex multi-year endeavor. So clearly for this to be successful, these activities need to be integrated or you're not going to be able to close the value gap. And I would therefore say that the third element of success is to make sure to the best of your ability that your work is aligned and integrated with others in your discipline. So what does that mean? It means that if you are in access, talk to your HEOR person. If you are in pricing, talk to your market access person. And if you are in a small pharma and you are all of these, then recognize that there is a lot to be done. And as you engage a partner, make sure that that external partner has got these lines of communications within their organization so that they are talking to each other. And so it is with Precision, where I'm based. Precision Value and Health was designed to shift the trajectory, drive value in the marketplace. And what you see here are 6 complementary capabilities within Precision Value and Health that are seamlessly aligned so that whether you are talking about access or pricing or scientific and medical communication or brand adoption or understanding the access environment, these capabilities are all connected internally within Precision to maximize that how we bring value to you. So to close, I believe there are 3 elements that will help us accelerate the delivery of life science innovation. Number 1, foundation. Understand the knowledge base from which you are coming, build that knowledge base early on and add to it. Number 2, communication. Make sure that you balance the justification for each individual study with how that study would contribute to the arc of the story over time. And thirdly, integration. Whether you are in a large complex organizational setting or whether you are in a small pharma or biotech setting, do your best to integrate and align with your colleagues. And if you are bringing on board a vendor to help you, make sure that they have the capabilities across the continuum to deliver the services you need. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sajad. That was a great kickoff to today's presentation. And it really gives me some real insight into something that I think Precision puts a lot of effort at, which is the integration across all of those different departments. It seems obvious, but in today's matrix organization that most of our groups work with, why do you think these continue to be such a challenge?
Patty, that's a great question. And I believe there are several factors, but I think there are three key underlying factors. I would say one is prioritization. Individuals are required to focus on very specific, oftentimes complex scientific deliverables. So it is very easy to forget the big picture. As while we are working on any individual study, we are too focused on the details. So it's important to remember the arc of the story and how that individual piece of evidence will tie into the arc of the story. The second underlying factor, revolves around the virtue of, humility or modesty. What I mean by that is that it really takes a village to develop and launch a drug. And this requires each individual to recognize that they're a part of a bigger endeavor. And while they may contribute significant value, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it's very, very easy to forget that. And the third underlying factor, in my opinion, is that we are really limited by the number of hours in the day. There is a lot to be done, and sometimes even the best of intentions, don't translate into actions. So I think those are some of the underlying factors that may be responsible for the fact that we continue to see that basic elements like foundation, communication, integration, continue to present a challenge. I mean, that's what we think.
Well, it's very, very interesting. I noticed that you spent a bit of time talking about validating the challenge, and I suspect that feeds into your consulting approach as to where you're going to recommend your clients spend their time.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's one of the key things we do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sajad. That was a great kickoff. And now I'd like to invite Stephen Fountain to engage his camera and come on and start us out with his presentation, Real-World Examples of Digitally Enabled Partnerships with Biotechnology Companies. Stephen, take it away.
Thanks very much, Paddy. So as Paddy said, I'm planning to take you through a couple of case studies of how we've developed long-term partnerships with biotech clients who we've collaborated with using our innovative market access digital applications. But first of all, on the next couple of slides, I just wanted to quickly introduce you to PRMA Consulting. So we're a global value evidence and access consulting team. We've been operating for 15 years. We have a multidisciplinary team at PRMA, about 100 people based across Europe, North America, and Asia. And on this slide, I've just quickly mapped out the typical value evidence and access questions that we tend to answer for our clients. So things like which assets should we be investing in, how we will support market access and pricing. If you could just advance the slides, please, Jesse. What's the optimal access strategy and route to market? How do you optimize the clinical trial program? What is the payer value proposition and the evidence that needs to be generated to support value? And how do we demonstrate and communicate value to players? Understanding the realistic price and optimal contracting strategy. And then post-launch, how do we maximize access and uptake? And then Jesse, if we go to the next slide, we've kind of then overlaid the value evidence and access solutions that our consulting team focus on a day-to-day basis. So things like BD, in-licensing, early pipeline planning, the market access landscape and opportunity assessments, market access strategy and roadmap design, optimization of the clinical trial programs, payer value proposition development testing, evidence generation strategy and planning, a lot of the value communications pieces, whether it's literature reviews, global value dossiers, objection handlers, and then pricing and contracting strategy through to the lifecycle management post-launch. But on the next slide, I just wanted to show you what really one of the key differentiators for PRMA Consulting is our digital applications. And there's 4 digital applications that we currently have in-house. The first is the PRMA Tracker, which tracks the HTA pricing reimbursement landscape for your key competitors to understand really critical success factors from a market access and pricing reimbursement perspective. We also have the PRMA Health Check, which helps understand payer evidence requirements and key vulnerabilities. So once you understand those, you can think about developing the evidence generation plan and market access strategy. We have the PRMA Navigator, which auto-generates HTA submissions in key markets based on standard core deliverables like the global value dossier or clinical study reports. And finally, we have the PRMA Access Accelerator, which is an online platform for collaborating with external advisors, whether it's advisory boards, forums, or surveys. So just on the next couple of slides, I'm going to present case studies of how we've used these digital applications to partner with 2 different biotech companies with products at different stages in the product life cycle. So the first case study is a small US-based biotech developing products for serious rare diseases. And they're about to actually enter into phase 3 studies of their second product in their pipeline, which was being developed for a rare cardiovascular disease. They want to understand the market access risks and opportunities, to understand the investment profile outside of the US. And they also wanted to understand how the phase 3 trial designs might be received by peers and how to optimize them. And then think about developing the evidence generation plan that would supplement the clinical trial program that they were running. So our solution was to use the PRMA Health Check digital application to identify those peer evidence gaps and key vulnerabilities and provide recommendations for how they could be mitigated and develop the evidence generation plan. So using the PRMA Health Check, we conducted a situation analysis to understand the current and evolving peer and disease landscape up until launch of the product. And then we mapped the evidence that is being generated for the particular asset against actual peer requirements in major 5 European markets and Canada, which can be seen in the heat map on the left-hand side of your screen. We also identified the key vulnerabilities for market access that would lead to suboptimal outcomes and developed a risk mitigation and evidence generation strategy plan to optimize those outcomes. And they were all incorporated into an interactive evidence generation plan, which splits activities by function and priority, as shown by the evidence generation Gantt chart on the right side there. And these key outputs were shared with the cross-functional team to ensure that we had alignment and communicate the market access perspective and potential outcomes at launch with the cross-functional team. The outputs also informed phase 3 trial design in terms of things like key endpoints, subgroups, comparators, and generalizability of the data to clinical practice. And that work that we did using the PRMA Health Check digital application resulted in several follow-on projects. So firstly, providing guidance on the approach to obtaining early scientific advice from key HTA agencies. And actually, in this case, the client decided to get advice from the GBA through a consultation meeting, and then joint scientific advice from NICE and CADIT in the UK and Canada. To support them, we developed early scientific advice briefing books, which were shared with the HTA agencies. We also facilitated mock early scientific advice meetings, at which those materials were shared with expert advisors in those markets in order to prepare for the actual early scientific advice meetings. And then we attended the meetings with the key HTA agencies and provided a report of the recommendations to our client. We also developed and tested a peer-focused value story using robust frameworks that we've developed in-house to explore product attributes and value drivers across key peer archetypes globally. And we worked with a cross-functional team to make sure that we'd incorporated their perspectives on the value of the product, particularly medical and commercial. We also tested the value story with advisors, external advisors, through virtual advisory panels in the US and also globally, to obtain some qualitative and also quantitative feedback on the payer value story and messaging. And then we adapted and optimized the payer value story for both the US and then also for global payer audiences. And that early payer engagement through early scientific advice really gave critical feedback for the client, and also then validated and supplemented the market access strategy and evidence generation plan that was developed through the PRMA Health Check digital application. And the value prop development and testing resulted in a compelling, coherent, and peer-validated value story, which was developed with input from the cross-functional team, and also then being able to tailor that value story to US and also global payer audiences, and identify some of those value evidence gaps and provide recommendations for how they could be filled. So the second case study was actually a mid-sized biotech client who was seeking approval of an oncology asset in Europe, so a later stage of development than the first case study. However, they really had little additional resource in the markets to develop HTA submissions and wanted some external support to increase time to patient access for their product. So if we just move on to the next slide, Jesse. PRMA Navigator, thanks. So our solution was to use our PRMA Navigator digital application, which auto-generates partial HTA submissions based on standard core materials. So as I mentioned, things like the global value dossier, clinical study report, economic model reports. And this work actually covered submissions in 20 Central and Eastern European markets. And we conducted this work in 6 different waves to make sure the process was manageable for the client, and also to prioritize major markets early on. And the process involved having strategy alignment meetings both with global and then each of the local markets to ensure that the right evidence was being pulled through for the local HTA submission, tagging content in those core standard materials like the global value dossier and other materials uploaded to the PRMA Navigator application, which then auto-generates the official HTA submission templates in each of the core markets that we were focusing on. We actually also partnered on this project with a network of local expert vendors in key markets to provide kind of full end-to-end HTA submission support for our clients, and then conducted a GBD gap analysis, which identified which peer evidence requirements actually could not be met during the auto-population and form future GBD development. So the PRMA Navigator really enabled significant time, resource, and cost savings for our clients. So based on a survey, we found that we can actually auto-generate up to 80% of a HTA submission, depending on which market it is. We reduced internal resource use by an average of 55% and external resource use by an average of 60%. And with only 2 hours of input from the affiliates and local vendors, we could provide those partially auto-populated HTA submissions, which then leaves a lot more time to think about local adaptation of the submission and focus on the strategy. Also, the core client team could ensure that that global HTA strategy was then pulled through into local HTA submissions. And the Navigator provides a way to process, track, and review and sign off on the HTA submissions. And us partnering with the local expert vendors provided that end-to-end HTA submission support. And we were able to share learnings effectively and quickly across different markets to maximize efficiencies, quality, and increase time to patient access. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure taking through a couple of those examples how we've supported our biotech clients using our digital applications.
That was great, Stephen. Thank you. So I'm particularly interested, you gave us a couple of case studies on the use of your PRMA digital applications and how it was used in value proposition development in HTA submissions in cardiovascular disease, one early, one a little bit later. Specifically, what are some of the advantages directly to the biotech manufacturer of using this digital approach compared with traditional approaches?
Absolutely. So I think the advantages probably differ depending on the digital application we're talking about. So the PRMA health check application really gives a robust framework and consistent methodology to understand the market access opportunities and challenges, and then to develop that evidence generation plan. It's both in-depth, so it's built on actual individual peer evidence requirements in each of the markets of interest, but then easy to interpret at the global level, so that visual heat map of where the evidence gaps are. It also allows numerous different stakeholders, whether it's global cross-functional teams or the regional, local stakeholders, to then access all of the content and analysis in a central place and hub, so they can collaborate, and also the plans can be communicated across the organization effectively. Mm-hmm. And the health checks, it's dynamic, it's a digital application. So as the clinical development program evolves, as additional evidence is generated, as the market evolves and the disease evolves, the health check can be updated at various time points. So hopefully you see those evidence gaps being closed over time as you near launch.
Mm-hmm. So it's a living document, going back to the original point in my presentation, that this is really an ongoing process.
And then the navigator is all more about the efficiency, so saving the time, resource, costs through automated content generation, and ensuring quality, that global strategy is pulled through into local submissions, enabling collaboration again on this one digital hub where you can access all the core documents and HTA submissions, and helping kind of planning and organization and tracking of that HTA submissions process for users.
Well, I think, audience, you probably are hearing this word collaboration and integration woven throughout all of the presentations. Stephen, thank you. Excellent.
Thanks,
presentation. Now, let's move on to Sonia Snedekor, who is going to close us out with the value of effective evidence communication. Sonia, I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Thank you all, and good morning. Most of the market access activities we've been talking about revolve around evidence generation. However, that evidence must also be communicated. So today I will present a few tips to help make those communications more effective. At OpenHealth, we understand the importance of both sides of market access. Our evidence and access practice is a full-service HEOR consultancy. Established over 20 years ago, our staff are experts in evidence generation within and across our 4 centers of excellence. Our medical communications practice provides information and education to the scientific community, patients, and the public. Together, our mission is to help manufacturers achieve success throughout all stages of the product launch cycle. In addition to the traditional payer and policymaker audiences, manufacturers also need to communicate HEOR evidence to increasingly diverse stakeholders. Often these now include clinicians, advocacy groups, and patients. The purpose of these communications is to persuade and inspire action. And the challenge is that each of these stakeholders has different interests and needs, so the communication message must be tailored appropriately for each. Evidence, which is also known as knowledge, is where we start. This is our focus when developing strategic market access plans and publication plans. We ask ourselves at that time, what is the knowledge we are going to create and communicate? These activities are fantastic and absolutely necessary, but knowledge alone is not sufficient to inspire action. Insight or guidance on how to interpret that knowledge must also be provided. This can be thought of as connecting the dots for the audience. And without this insight, your message will only be understood by those who already know what you're trying to convey. And so getting the audience to a place of understanding is necessary. However, it's still not sufficient for action. Relevance also has to accompany that message. The relevance is the so what and the why should I care about your information. Think about all the understanding we have about healthy diet and proper exercise. Yet that understanding still does not inspire many to change their behavior. Only when people understand the message and why they should care about it will the audience value your information and take the action you want. What happens if we don't provide all of these communication ingredients? Few people think about the costs of ineffective communication, but when evidence is not clear, understandable, and relevant, it can result in loss of time, trust, and potentially adverse decision-making. Today, I'll give a few tips for effective communication and present some case studies for novel communication methods. First, we want to create a narrative. Literacy is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history. The earliest humans date some 300,000 years or so, but the earliest writings are only 5,000 years old. This means that for millennia, we have evolved to document and communicate knowledge amongst ourselves through stories. Needless to say, it's still the case today that stories are more engaging, easier to understand, and most importantly, easier to remember than a list of facts. The more scientific style of communication is certainly valuable, and it's necessary early in the product life cycle, particularly during the evidence launch and the evidence generation phase. As a product moves toward its launch and post-launch period, the communications evolve to more narrative style as products' value stories are developed and communicated to diverse audiences. You also want to keep the message simple. Try to give the audience the exact amount of information that's necessary to understand your message, no more and no less. If there's too much information, the audience will struggle to figure out how the extra stuff is relevant. Ultimately, this muddles your key message and confuses people. And when faced with information overload, your audience may disregard everything and make conclusions based on what they already know, or they'll even decline to engage at all. The third feature of effective communications is to make it visual whenever possible. Neuroscientists have shown that the part of our brains responsible for seeing has decision-making power without needing to involve the analytic portions. This means that we can comprehend the information and visuals quickly without having to think about them. Here's an example. Which of these two depicts a triangle? Even though they both do, most of us immediately recognize the image on the right as a triangle without having to think about it at all. Another team of researchers showed pictures of salad to elementary school children, which resulted in more salad consumption at a summer camp. This means that if pictures of salad can get children to choose to eat vegetables, just think of the influence they could have on our audiences. And when visuals are interactive, they're even better at communicating insight, generating action, and inspiring effective decisions. The first case study is a solution for a meta-analysis publication, including 26 studies, 8 outcomes, and 6 time points. This represents a lot of data that cannot be presented within the body of a manuscript. To present these data in an engaging way, we created an interactive file distributed with the manuscript as a supplementary appendix. With this application, a user can walk an audience through the analysis objectives, view the inputs used for analysis in depth, either at a high level or with additional details on demand. The user can also review the results of each outcome and each time point in depth. Next slide, please. Interactive analytic applications put the analysis and the interpretation in the hands of the user. In this cost effectiveness model demo, we show how users can dynamically calculate results based on local inputs and highlight the results they want to focus on. In this example, the probability of being cost effective based on each payer's willingness to pay threshold is easily identified. And even dynamically calculated sensitivity analyses are possible within the application. Customized analytic tools can help smaller companies with limited budgets move an adaptation or ad hoc analysis investigations in-house. Once the initial research project has been completed, incorporating that work into an analytic tool can be cost and time efficient by allowing internal teams to perform subsequent what-if sensitivity analyses or local adaptations in-house. In this demo, we have a network meta-analysis, which is often required to be rerun with a different collection of treatment comparators for each country submission. Here, users can deselect individual treatments and or studies to exclude them from the analysis. They can then generate the results and download them for future use. And so in conclusion, thank you so much for your participation. I hope you've been inspired by this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Sonia. I really appreciated taking a look at some of those digital tools. And I imagine that we've got many audience members out there that are thinking, wow, I've got something sitting on the shelf or in my computer that is a more traditional format. Might I be able to take that and convert it to one of these other mediums or platforms? Talk to us a little bit about the possibility of that.
That's right. There are Excel, most models, most analytic tools are created in Excel, which is great. Excel is a very, very useful tool for a lot of applications. There are other methods that can be more engaging. And we know in today's society, there's a lot competing for our attention. And you want to be able to give the audience the information they need to know quickly up front. Almost anything that can be done in Excel, in fact, really anything that can be done in Excel can be made into, say, a web-based interactive tool that can also be used offline. We know that some local affiliates or some field teams, they have to go into the hospital basement and talk to people where there's no internet. These can live offline. If there are analytics that, say, Excel cannot do, that would need more complex programming, which would need to be hosted online, but visually they would look exactly the same. And these tools can also be developed and deployed via the manufacturer's Viva platform, which I know a lot of manufacturers use.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Let's invite all of the rest of our speakers to come on camera, and we'll take questions from the audience. We've got several that have come in, and I hope you'll keep them coming. If we don't get to all of them before the top of the hour, audience, I want you to know that we are going to follow up with a blog where we also address some of your questions, and you'll also be able to directly reach out to our speakers for some direct advice. I'd like to direct this one to Sajad. What different roles does a market access vendor play versus the market access group in a manufacturer? So what are the vendor roles versus the market access manufacturer-based roles? And this is from Jenny.
Sure. No, Patty, that's a great question. The role that kind of the market access vendor can play even during manufacturing, or particularly during clinical development as you're working on the clinical trials, it's important to start thinking about market access not after your phase 3 results or when you are about to launch. Of course, you need to you need to start thinking about right when you're designing your, product, or when you're designing your clinical trials. How often it happens that we have endpoints in the clinical trials that are very clinically relevant to, get the FDA approval. However, they rarely match the requirements that payers are looking for. Now, ideally, you want to have key endpoints, and that's something a market access person can, work with the clinical developers, or a market access vendor can help with your clinical development team, to help them nail down that, okay, fine, these are the key endpoints that the FDA will look for. But here are a few things that are very important from market access perspective. And if you don't start to think about them right now, you can't go back and design and do all this stuff again. So you need to have at least some endpoints that, even if you are not covering direct endpoints, some of the clients, that collect surrogate endpoints. But for that, it becomes incredibly important that at the same time, you also produce some evidence, if it does not exist already in the literature, that links those surrogate endpoints to hard endpoints that, payers are looking for. How often it happens that some endpoints are very important from clinical perspective or from patient perspective, but they are not that important from payer perspective, because a payer is wearing a different hat and have a different perspective. So the role that vendor can play is not only in your market access issue or pricing, but the vendors can definitely work with your clinical development teams. When we are developing your evidence generation plans, they can take a hard look at what you're doing in terms of your clinical development and opine there that these are the key things to kind of keep an eye out for as you're working on clinical trial. Or if you're not developing any, collecting those things in clinical trials, maybe start a parallel study or alternate studies that may be able to link some of your data, once you have positive results, to hard endpoints that, payers are looking for. So there are several different roles. I just give you one example.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And audience, we talked a little bit at the top of the hour that you can avail yourselves of these experts that are on the screen, as well as another 350 that focus in the market access, HEOR, and RWE arena, using the value evidence and access marketplace. And even if you are not at the point where you're ready to conduct a study, but you're just at the conceptualization process, I think everybody on the screen here it welcomes that type of engagement to figure out what the strategy is and where you need to put your efforts. So use the marketplace and reach out to these individuals as well. Stephen, this is for you. What are some of the unique market access challenges that you have experienced with your biotechnology clients as compared with big pharma?
Well, so I think, from that perspective, the differences between smaller biotech companies and larger pharmaceutical companies is that the biotechs tend to need a different level of support. The market access HUR tends to be generally maybe less well established and resourced. So there's more or a greater role to play supporting them. Very often there's time pressures, as market access tends to be considered later on in some cases. So, we need to be organized and making sure that we ensure timely delivery of the work. They can sometimes be less well funded as well. So making sure that we deliver efficiently without compromising on quality. And biotech companies, I would say, tend to be more led by the science. So there's often quite an educational need, perhaps not to the people that we're working with directly in market access or HUR, but to the cross-functional team. So educating medical and commercial and persuading them of the need for support in terms of market access. And I think this is where kind of a lot of our digital applications play a really good role for our client, and they help meet our clients' needs from a lot of those different perspectives.
Thank you very much. Sonia, let's go with a lightning round response to this question, because we are up at the top of the hour, but I want to make sure that we get this one in. Give me one key example that you would recommend converting from a traditional tool to a digital tool. If somebody's going to do this, where would you say that they should reach out to you for advice on? You're muted.
Thank you so much. I'm going to build upon what Stephen just mentioned is that when you have, particularly when you have smaller companies, you have a lot of people wearing a lot of different hats, and you have to communicate this to, medical affairs, the VP of commercial, all of these people who may not understand HEOR. And that's really where you want to really hone the message of what it is, the evidence that you're talking about and generating. And then they also ask reflex questions. So the case study that we gave on a network meta-analysis, that would be particularly for submission purposes. But if we could imagine, say, systematic reviews happen all of the time, we can just as efficiently put the data that you get a lot of data from a systematic review. You get a lot of data from a systematic review in a tool that you can look and see the data on your own, or the biotech company personnel can do that. Investigate the data, answer these reflex questions that come from, the commercial, the medical, clinical, all of the people. And so that's one tool that they can do on their own without having to be reliant on a vendor to do these ad hoc analyses.
Thank you so much. Those SLRs are probably the most common project sourced through our marketplace. So everyone is doing that for almost every product multiple times in the development timeline. So good example. Well, with that, I would like to thank all three of you for a really enlightening presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and audience in particular, thank you for giving us an hour of your time to learn a little bit more about Biotech Market Access. I hope you found it helpful. And I would like to invite you to stay tuned. You're going to be sent an email within the next day that's going to have an on-demand recording of this. So if you'd like to go back and revisit it or share it with your colleagues, so you'll be receiving that. So once again, thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.